Hi, this is Maria, and this is just a little review of the Hardy-Weinberg. All right, so of course, there's the important equation. So p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. And then, of course, p plus q equals 1. All of these equations and these different terms, you should know what they mean. It's really important. So I would pause right now, see what you remember. Okay, so here to check your answers, you can go ahead and take a look through. Do remember a few things when we're talking about these ones. These are all about the individuals versus if we're talking about the P and the Q, we're talking about the allele. Remember, allele is just a version of a gene. And so if we're talking about different alleles, we're talking about only in this particular case, two versions of it, the dominant and the recessive. If there's more than two versions of an allele, you will need to change this equation. You've done that before. You'll do it again, but it's just something to remember. We only use this equation for just telling whether a population is undergoing evolution. We look at essentially an initial population and then maybe a population 5 generations later. We're looking to see if the P and Q values are changing. And they have to change. In this particular class, we're always going to have it change significantly, though, of course, realistically, that's not something that always happens. So the population is evolving if the P and Q values are changing. Just keep that in mind when going through. There are some factors that can cause evolution. Small population, non-random mating, so essentially where there's some sort of sexual selection. That's something that you're going to learn about, or artificial selection. Mutations, if there's mutations that occur to make maybe more versions of an allele or something like that. Immigration or emigration from a population, which really just means individuals either leaving or entering a population. And then natural selection. If a population's not evolving, it's in equilibrium. Just something to keep in mind. All right, so practice problem number 1. So this will be the first part of this problem. And I just have our Hardy-Weinberg up here just for us to kind of keep in mind when going through. All right, so 22 of 510 moths show a gray phenotype, which is recessive to the brown phenotype. So what is being shown to me right here is essentially I already have my Q squared value. That's what the numbers are really telling me in this problem. And then what I'm trying to find is the number of individuals who are heterozygotes. Okay, so this is easy enough. Let me go ahead and find my Q squared. Do remember, a lot of times I've seen students make mistakes where you just plug in 22. Remember, it's got to be a frequency. It's not the number of individuals, it's the frequency of the individuals. And so therefore, you need to put it in as like a decimal form. That's what you're trying to do. Once you've plugged that in, you end up with your Q squared value. And of course, I just take the square root of both sides and I end up with my Q value. Great. Once I have my Q value, I can figure out my P value by plugging it into the P plus Q equals 1. Cool. And then since I'm trying to find the number of individuals who are heterozygotes, I have to figure out the frequency of heterozygotes. So I just plug in my P and my Q values and then multiply by 2. That's what this is. And then I multiplied the number of individuals in the population by the 2pq value. This is what I get. And I end up with 168 heterozygotes in total. All right, easy. Now, this would be the part B of this. So if I'm looking at the populations of moths, it's gone from 510 to 722. And there's 710 brown moths. And then you're just being asked, is this population in equilibrium, and how do you know? Whenever you see, is this population in equilibrium and how do you know? That means solve for the P and the Q values. That's really what it is. Now, do note that since this is 710 brown moths, that means that this is essentially individuals that are showing the dominant phenotype. That does not mean that it's the P squared value. It means it's the P squared value plus the 2pq value. So that's what I have here. But you can see this is not a logical thing to solve. So we're not going to solve for this. It makes much more sense to go, oh, well, the rest of those individuals must be showing the recessive phenotype. And if that's true, I can easy peasy solve for q squared. That's what I'll do. And once I have my q, I have my p-value. Now do remember, those values are very different from my q values and my p-values on the other page. So therefore, my population is not in equilibrium, and my population is evolving. All right, so let's do another practice problem. So now I'm looking at a population of birds, and 546 of them display the dominant phenotype of blue feathers. How many of them are homozygous dominant? Okay, so what I'm being asked to solve for is for the p-squared value, is essentially what I'm going to need. Okay, great, I can do that. Again, this is essentially showing the dominant phenotype of blue feathers. Well, that's the p-squared plus the 2pq value. Again, makes no sense to solve for this. This would be way too hard. We're not doing that. So what we're going to do instead is solve for the q value. Same thing as before. You have the q value. And then we'll plug it into the p plus q equals 1 and solve for our p. So now that I have the p-value, I can calculate the p-squared, and then I'll just multiply the population of birds. Again, as it says in the problem, round to the nearest whole number. And so I would have 314 homozygous dominant individuals. All right, so this is my part B. So after 5 generations, the bird populations increased to 719 birds. 52 of these show the gray feathers. So remember, that means that I essentially have my q squared already. And then I'm being asked to figure out the number of heterozygotes in this new population. Okay, I have this q squared, solve for q, do my same p plus q, plug that in, figure out the p, and then round to the nearest whole number after I figured out my 2pq. Great, do the same thing as before. And I have 283 heterozygotes. Awesome. All right, so part C. So did the populations of birds evolve from part A to part B? Why or why not? So in part A, these are the values that I ended up getting for the p value here. And if you go back, this is also the q value as well. If I round to the p and q values here, you'll see both the p values and q values, they end up rounding to the same number in part A and in part B. So if that's true, the population of birds did not evolve since the frequency of these two alleles did not change between part A and part B. All right, just 2 tips for Hardy-Weinberg problems. You'll notice in all the work that I did that I carried 4 decimal places throughout the problem. And then I rounded to 2 decimal places when asked for the frequency of the alleles, or if I was trying to compare those 2 alleles. It made it a lot easier just to compare when going through. The big thing to remember is to read the problem carefully and write out all your work, because often you'll go back and use some of the work as you did before. So as I did for that very last problem. All right, well, that's about it for review. Hopefully this helped, and feel free to ask any questions during class if something didn't make sense.